when I make games, I try to get emotions out of people. So
Yeah.
what's this emotional journey that someone is taking over the course of playing a game, right? And what are those rises and falls? And when we pull back away from that, what story is it telling to the player about what they just did, right?
We have Stephen Dinehart on the podcast to talk about how you can get started in video game development. Stephen also shares tips for making a game emotional that people will just attach to. They'll love because it makes them happy. It makes them sad. It makes them cry. Stephen has a ton of actual advice for you if you are wanting to get started in video game development. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to follow or subscribe to this podcast and share with any other friends that may want a tech guide. You can also learn more about us at techguide.org. Steven, I'm so excited to talk about your background in video game development.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Good to be here.
I'm super excited. I've been wanting to ask this question for a long time since I've been looking at your background. But you've worked on projects for like Electronic Arts, Warner Brothers, NBC, Nintendo. You published books about video games. You worked on games across role-playing games, horror games, strategy games, action games, any game under the sun. So a broad question to kick us off. Like, what is a favorite game you've developed and a story you like to share from it?
Right. I think still my favorite game that I ever made is Company of Heroes.
Mm,
The team was second to none. And for me, it's a World War II strategy game. My family fought in World War II. My grandfather
cool.
was still around when I was working on it. So I got to talk to him and try to recreate that. And going through that process was really rewarding for me. And players loved it. And they still play it to this day. It was just re-released on mobile last spring. So you can play my campaigns for COH now on mobile, which is pretty neat. And gosh, what's a neat antidote from that? I wish I could have, I mean, we had so much fun with that team, Nerf guns all over the place, and just always a sense of going to work with your buddies to make something cool. And yeah, I guess it was the first time I walked a red carpet, and I was nominated for best writing in a game production, which was cool because I was just sort of out of grad school and just sort of spent all this money to like become a games professional. And it really did cost a lot of money. And it wasn't like a turnkey thing, but I went to get my master's degree and was studying. And then within 6 months of that, I moved up to Canada and took this job at Relic Entertainment. And I created this thing called the narrative designer. And I wrote the job description in my parents' basement, and they approved it. And then eventually offered it to me. They didn't right away. So that was challenging. But several months later, they were like, we can't find anyone else. Okay, you could take it. which was nice that they let me take it. Cause obviously if you're going to write a job description, you're going to make yourself like the perfect candidate.
For sure.
I basically just described myself in the JD. And so I was brought into work. Gosh, I'm not giving you one good story. So I was brought into work my first day, and I was trained as a visual artist. I'm a game developer. I've become a writer and a screenwriter sort of by training and from work, really. And I had never played the original Company of Heroes, which oddly now contains my work because of patching and stuff. But so they sat me down at a computer and said, "Hey, you're going to write the follow-up to this hit World War II strategy game." And I thought, 3 days. Oh. But we did it, and we produced a very well acclaimed follow-up to the original. And so I got nominated with what were the other games there that year? It was like Scarface and gosh, what was the BioWare game? The big BioWare game, the sci-fi one. I can't think of what it's called.
Yeah.
But I was the only one that was up there as an individual, which was pretty cool. So I was nominated for my writing as best writing as game production. It was nice. The studio like gave me the nod and it said my name. And then Seth MacFarlane was the presenter. So this is the cool antidote, I guess. He said my name. And so I was like, yeah, I didn't get the award, but it's like, hey, but Seth MacFarlane said my name. I got to go on a red carpet event at Hux. That was pretty
That's so sick. That's so sweet. I'm really curious when just in mobile, like just in game development as a whole, can you give us like for this game or any game in particular, like what's a high level overview of the process from like start to finish for a video game?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really varies based on studio and the production. So that one was so long ago. I mean, I could sit here and tell a story about it, but really the way it usually works is something is developed by a team that's sort of playable. You call it a prototype, but frankly, a lot of times it's sort of misdirected and it's just people kind of classic tech style getting
Yeah.
together in a broom closet and developing something that sort of works.
Yeah.
And then they show it to a publisher and the publisher goes, oh, yeah, that's great. Why don't we spend some more money and get some more people to help you to make that a better game? And then you kind of ramp it up that way. So the process that I teach, though, is a little different. And this is what I try to do with my games these days is design with intent. So
Mm.
rather than just like messing around in a game engine
Yeah.
until like you find something that sort of works, which I've done before myself, try to be intentional with my design choices. And so that I'm trying to deliver on goals. And it really helps to kind of frame what you're creating up front and to experience it very quickly. Because a lot of times on productions, you can't really experience it. I mean, we all, I think, had conversation with somebody who says they're making a game and they just talk about it
Yeah.
forever. And I'm like, okay, can we play the game? Like, no, you can't play it. Well, you're not actually making a game.
Yeah.
And I was guilty of that before myself. Yeah, with Giant Lands, my RPG that I released, I guess, about almost 2 years ago now. It took me a long time to get that off the ground. And I mean, I was actually just mentioning something to one of the guys who I first pitched it to at Electronic Arts. This is actually
Interesting.
how I got my internship. That's what I was. It was grad school internship with Electronic Arts, working on Lord of the Rings and all this stuff. But I went
So
in there and I pitched this document that I sort of in my head I thought it was a game. And at the time, I understand why I was in that position,
yeah.
but it would take me a number of years before I realized, well, actually, what I showed him wasn't a game at all. It was just an
Mm.
idea, like written in paper. And I was attempting to communicate a game idea, but it wasn't really anything you could play. So these days, I try to get to a playable as quickly as possible. It's sort of like the same thing. How many people, I guess not, it's not as normal these days, but, oh, I'm working on a novel or
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
working on a screenplay, right? Oh, well, I'm in research mode. Well, you'd be there forever.
Ever.
Yeah. And when I'm guilty of this too, like my book, Narrative Designer, that probably took me about 15 years to get out the door from
Wow.
when I first wanted to do it. And I just never shared it and dragged, but way too much.
Yep.
And eventually got it out the door. And going through that process was helpful for me.
Hmm.
In the sense that it helped me change my attitude and think, I want to do this. I'm going to write a book every 15 years. I'll never get a body of work. Be the finisher, get it done, move on. If it's good enough, you go back and you can edit it in the future. I just edited my book, still editing it. I don't know, a new version, but that's part of the problem with digital. You can only kind of always update it. So I read through it again. And the hell is this sound? You can hear just getting rid of pieces here and there. So yeah, I mean, the real thing is to get to something playable.
Interesting.
And until you have a game that you can play, it's not a game. And what's interesting about games, it's sort of unlike different forms of media that sort of exist as objects. While there are game objects and things, it really only exists in our head.
Mm.
So the game isn't really even there until we start playing it. Everything
Yep.
else is sort of like framing to like get your mind in the right place to play the game. And so that's what I really try to get people to do, whether it's my students or my own productions. On Giant Lands, actually, I did something a little different because I had my boyhood idols on contract.
Yep.
And I wanted to learn their process because as a kid, I tried to emulate them. And so I kind of went back to the old way of doing things. And I'm glad that I saw how they made games, but it's
Yeah.
very different from how I make them now. So it's much more of like an authorship model.
Yep.
And James Ward said, okay, give me my check. I'm going to go write this now for the next 6 months. Oh, that's not how this works.
So when you're,
I want to have a playable next week.
yeah. So when you're creating games, it sounds like you start with like an end goal in mind. Like, what do you want this to like look like when it's all said and
Yeah,
done?
design intent. And so we talk about it like the experience statement. Like
Mm.
what's the experience? What do you want people to say about what they've just experienced about that game?
Okay, I really, really like that. And so, like, when you are designing a game, I'm curious because, like, I played a lot of games. I played action games, like shooting games, sports games were always like my favorite. So, can you give us like a breakdown of like what goes into creating a great game from like a percentage standpoint? Is it like 25% the story, 25% graphics, 25% like the feel of it, or what's the percentage that you would give?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I don't think I'd be able to answer it in a way that you'd be satisfied,
Okay.
because the truth is, it's not that kind of a recipe.
Mm,
I had the conversation with someone the other day when I first started working in theme parks. I was brought in as this team of game design experts to help these theme park guys figure out how to make games, right?
so cool.
And they sort of had this attitude like it was a lamp, right? Oh, just hang the game over there. Yeah, can you just put the game, can you just install the game over there for us? That's great. And that's not really how it works. So it's
Mm,
not like lighting. It's not like you can just hang a lamp and, the job is done, right?
yeah.
And I don't want to say that lighting is simple, but it's much more kind of concrete,
Yep.
right? And with a game, I mean, what we really are is sort of like designing for emotions. I create emotions in people, right? This is a conversation I've had with a bunch of people actually in recent weeks is, well, and it's part of the problem that people start saying like, oh, well, this has to be fun. Well, what is fun,
Yeah.
right? We can get real deep on that, write books and get doctorates on it, but no one really has the answer because it's a weird word. And what is really fun? So sometimes things that are challenging are fun. I'd prefer to think of like low states.
Interesting.
And yes, when I make games, I try to get emotions out of people. So
Yeah.
what's this emotional journey that someone is taking over the course of playing a game, right? And what are those rises and falls? And when we pull back away from that, what story is it telling to the player about what they just did, right?
Interesting.
So for me, it's games are the word I like to use is the Gesamtkunstwerk. I don't speak German. I don't know how you would say it in German. Probably.
Yeah.
Gesamtkunstwerk. Yeah. Well, I don't really know. So it was from Richard Wagner. I talk about it all the time because it changed my life when I read about this 20 years ago, 25
Yeah.
years ago, whatever it was. And so this essay he wrote called The Artwork of the Future. And I was talking about this future kind of opera, but really games are like, it brings all this kind of stuff together under
Interesting.
one roof, and you have to kind of balance it all out. So it sort of depends on the game that you're developing, what
Mm,
kind of emotions you want to get out of it, what target audience you have for it.
interesting.
And that will sort of determine those sorts of decisions. Maybe it's a style of game that you're trying to create. So we're sort of guilty of this a lot and games where we just repeat. Well, let's just make that again, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm guilty of it myself. So, but it's part of the nostalgia and just sort of what we do as a species, which is interesting. I mean, we've been making games for thousands of years, and if you look at say chess, it
Mhm.
took about 1,000 years before we got what we have now with the Queen's game.
Yeah.
And that was sort of an iteration that happened cross culturally through different societies over hundreds of years, right? So
Yep.
everyone's sort of part of that sort of legacy, or should I say part of that canon? What's the word I'm looking for? But they brought chess to what it is. So
For
these
sure.
days that's truncated a lot and that process happens a lot more quickly. Let's say the other day, my buddy's game, Genova, I made this game called Journey for the PlayStation, right?
Interesting.
And someone, I mean, I guess that's pretty old now, relatively speaking, but it was in someone's deck, a game from 10 years ago. And they said, I want my game to be like Journey, this game, and that other game, right? So
Interesting.
it's sort of the way we end up developing games. And it's rare. I think Will Wright, the creator of the Sims was the guy that first kind of told me about this. He was giving a talk I was at. And he created a whole new kind of genre of gameplay with SimCity
Yeah.
and urban planning. You tell people you're going to make a game about urban planning, and they're like, "Well, that definitely does not sound fun."
Yeah.
Yeah. But he did it, and it was a lot of fun, and it changed the world. And now we got the Sims and all this other stuff that kind of
Yep.
these additional types of game types that come out of it. So that's a rare thing. This new
Mhm.
style of play, a new sort of game system, right? And once that happens, though, we're really good at like repeating that
Yeah.
and trying to replicate it. I guess Flappy Bird might be a good example.
Yeah. Yeah.
It blew up, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
so
Yep.
suddenly everyone thought, man, I could clone this. And no one really could. It was, I mean, it had this special magic to it.
Yeah.
And so, and that game is an interesting example too for the fun stuff. You know, it
Yeah.
was, in some ways it was an awful game, right? But that was part of the fun.
Interesting. So when you went designing on the World War II game, I'm blanking on it so bad. I'm so sorry.
And no worries, I'm babbling.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're good. Like how did you do this? Because World War II games, like what was your target audience and like what were like the first steps you took to designing it?
Well, again, that was different, okay? Because that was a sequel to an established franchise
Yeah.
at a major studio. So, I mean, the truth is, a lot of times in AAA games, I'm kind of a doctor. I mean, I was sort of a doctor on with the theme park stuff too.
Yeah.
People are in development for ages. This happened on the Fear game that I worked on, which was when I started on was Fear 2, and then it became Fear 3. And my job was sort of to help it become Fear 3
Yeah.
because the team thought they were making Fear 2. And then this witcheroo happened because of a business deal.
Interesting.
And Warner Brothers was like, hey guys, by the way, that game, that sequel game that you're making, that's going to be number 3. And you know what? Monolith already developed Fear 2. Everyone on the team was like, wow. So they had spent 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, whatever it was, developing out this game that was pretty cool. But it wasn't ready to ship.
Yep.
So that's when I usually come in. And it was sort of the same thing with Super Nintendo World. I didn't arrive with a blank slate. I
Yeah.
arrived, actually, so much of the stuff was already done.
Interesting.
They just didn't know how to make it a game and they needed help. And I'm glad they enlisted us to help. And at some points, people were like, hey, should we just not have any game in Super Nintendo World? I was
No.
really bad idea, guys. It really upsets some people if you do that. And that's really what it's about. So I tell people that if you want to do stuff for yourself, maybe you just go like be an artist, maybe go be an author, and then you can write those stories. You can paint those pictures. Game design is really sort of a service.
Interesting.
You're helping people and you don't really do it for yourself. I mean, when you start off, you kind of are there, but I'm at a point now where like, I would have no problem making a Barbie game, right?
Interesting.
Or like a game about weddings, right? Aimed at preteens or something. Because for me, when I get happy is when my players are happy. And I don't really care who those people are, frankly, as long as they're the people that like I've made something for. And that's sort of the fun of the theme park stuff because it's and with a game like Company of Heroes, the audience was pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
And now it's broadened a lot in recent years with the Fear game as well. Like Fear players, pretty hardcore people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I wasn't one of them, but I had to make stuff that made them feel more invested in the Fear franchise. So I didn't want to express myself.
How do you do that? How do you like make them feel more invested through a game?
Yeah, that's hard. All right. Well, that's sort of my job as this narrative designer is just the emotions, right? So you get them emotionally invested, sort of trickery, right?
Yeah.
A film I often try to get people to watch, particularly my students, is this Orson Welles film called F is for Fake. And it's really about trickery. I don't like to be deceptive, so I don't want to act like, haha, we're tricking people. But no, we are helping people to get into a mindset where they can act out a fantasy or play, right? And for some people, that's hard.
Yeah.
Right. So, and those people, they're really kind of my goal because it's easy for someone that already plays or already knows a franchise to get into something. Right.
Yeah.
But we try to broaden it. Right. And to get more people involved in it. So with hardcore fans, it's very difficult to please them. It's one reason I don't like working with fans and people say, oh, I'm a big fan. I'm guilty of saying it sometimes too, but the truth is I'm not a fan of much. Okay, I used to be, but now I make stuff for fans. And people say, you're a gamer. Well, not really. I mean, I think I used to be. Games are my work. It's my profession, right?
Yeah.
And for me, what that means is delivering stuff for players. So when I go to Super Nintendo World, I will probably be emotional, but for different reasons. And what will make it meaningful for me is seeing the guests play.
Yeah.
Right. And when they're in that space and they start crying or they experience joy for defeating Bowser or whatever it is, it's like they got the blue shell finally. That's the reward for me, that it's working for them. The illusion, as it is an illusion, is working for them. And the crying thing is interesting. I guess this came up the other day as well. I can't take much responsibility for it, but people do cry when they go to Super Nintendo World now, at least according to YouTube.
Yeah.
And I've seen it myself in parks I've made, ones that I just visited or I guess was part of. So like when I worked there at Universal, I spent a lot of time studying the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, and I was
That's
there in the
so
park
cool.
all the time. And people really do cross through London and into Diagon Alley and start crying
Oh, that's so cool.
because it's so visceral. It's this thing that was a complete fiction, always on the screen, and suddenly they're walking through it.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, there's people that are going through the green pipe and coming out the other side inside of Super Nintendo World and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe this is real. Illusion, but it's real enough, right?
Yep. Yep.
So our job is just as sort of media makers is to suspend disbelief, right? We're all so cynical. We're all so
Yeah.
cynical these days. Society is so cynical. So whatever you can do as for me, at least as a designer, to kind of suspend that disbelief. I want you to believe, because the more you believe, the more invested you'll be in an experience and the more you'll get out of it. And so, that can be challenging, but it's really rewarding. And yeah, so in an ideal world, a game starts with an idea, right? Some kind of premise. I'll talk about the game Cloud. There was another one I worked on in grad school with Genova. And I remember, for instance, when he came up with the idea for that game, he said he was just like laying back looking up at the clouds and thought, hey, wouldn't it be fun to play with the clouds? Oh,
Interesting.
that's a great premise, right? So let's figure out how to play with the clouds. Now, it became a very different game when we first documented the game and made this document for it. It was a war game on Jupiter about controlling weather systems on Jupiter. And the final game isn't anything like that. It's more like a Miyazaki movie
Yeah. Yeah.
with like magic enchanting music by Vince. And people cried from it because that experience of flight, I guess, was so potent for them and that it brought them to an emotional state they didn't expect, I think. And so, yeah, I mean, really that's what we're doing. And this is a filmmaker too. I'm an artist and I design for emotions because I want
Yeah.
to have players have specific feelings when they're doing activities. So the way we do that is sort of like science, right?
Hmm.
We prototype it, we get people to use it, we observe, we take the results from that, and then we tweak it again and we watch how they interact with it. We observe, we go, well, is that what we wanted at that moment? Is that the feeling we wanted to create when this character died or when they crossed a certain
That's
boundary?
cool.
And if it's not, then maybe we need to go back to the table. Now, sometimes it's a discovery process. You go, wow, I had no idea that would be so meaningful,
Interesting.
but let's go towards that. 'Cause that's really cool. We just found a really neat emotion that's happening there. So let's try to cater to it. Maybe we can get more out of it. So it's a discovery process sometimes, but yeah, a lot of times it's pretty messy. So Company of Heroes Posing Fronts, I guess, was the game we were talking about initially. So when I was brought onto that, the team had been in development again, I think for 18 months or something like that. It was a little more directed. They knew that they were making a sequel,
Yeah.
but they sort of were in this mode where they were left to their own devices and just kind of wheels were just kind of spinning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then new publisher shows up and, tries to get people in line. Says, hey guys, we need to ship this title. And that's sort of how it works. Game developers just kind of mess around and with millions of dollars, but that's sort of how that gets done. Yeah. But then you get this thing that kind of works that may or may not be playable. And someone usually steps in and says, hey guys, it's usually the publisher, the
Yeah.
person with the purse strings. Hey guys, we need to ship this. This needs to be a product in a box out the door, or this is a bad investment. So we're going to give you 6 million more bucks or 12 million or whatever it is.
Interesting.
And we want this done in 6 to 18 months
Interesting.
because we're going to ship it.
Yep.
So
yeah.
that process is not good. It's messy, but it still happens a lot.
Interesting. So we've talked a lot about like getting into gaming and like creating a game, but we also need to talk about like how people can actually like start getting into a game. And we're kind of winding down on time, but like, how would you advise someone they're listening to this? Like, oh my God, this sounds awesome. I want to create video games. I want to make people happy when they play my game. I want to make people sad when they play my game. Where would you advise someone to like start if they want to get into video game development?
Make a game. Make it. You can make games with paper. You can make them with sticks and mud. You don't necessarily need to make it on the computer. Most of my game design students, the first thing I do is have them look at an old board game And then we kind
Mm,
of take it apart and remix it. Right. And you'd be surprised how quickly it becomes a totally different game. And that I think is a real freeing process for people because a lot of it
interesting.
really happens in your head. It's design thinking. So it's not necessarily so technical. You can go
Mhm.
learn those tools, but the sort of soft aspect of it, you should be able to game design with anything. Now, if you want a very particular technical job
Yeah.
and you like being on the computer all day, like so many of us are these days, but yeah, you can get a specialization in some kind of engine. These days,
Interesting.
everyone wants Unreal generally. There are proprietary engines out there still. So some of them you can't use until you work at that company, like
Interesting.
EA, and then you kind of can use EA's
Mm,
tool. Forget even what it's called now. My buddy told me the other day, I forget. But yeah, when they develop engines at different studios and they're big proprietary, so they generally don't get out. That's happening less and less though with tools like
interesting.
Unreal. So in some ways, it's this real boon. You could say, I'm going to learn Unreal, and I'm confident that you'd be really good at it in 12 to 18 months.
Interesting.
And you could probably go out and get work making stuff in Unreal because you know how to use the tool.
Interesting.
Now, is that game design? Not really. It's,
Mm,
it's understanding how to use a piece of software, but there's enough of a need out there for people to just know how to use the software
yeah.
that it's an easy way to gain employment. So technical knowledge, my sort of position, I am a technologist.
Yeah.
I tend to work like in writing documents and stuff like that.
And so
Not so tech heavy. I don't get into engine much unless I'm doing it myself.
mm,
And those are sort of rare. It's not common. My first games were just games that I made on my own on my computer
that's
or
cool.
games that I made to play with my friends, like on tabletop, right?
Yeah.
So you don't need so much fancy stuff. And we're all capable of this. It's inherent to us.
That's cool.
So play games and make games. It's sort of the same. I don't know. You want to be a filmmaker, go make a movie. I mean, you could study it, sure, but like just go make one and you'll learn a lot. And the same is true for games. And there's all these resources out there these days that are free. And back in the day, that wasn't necessarily true to the point where, I mean, if you developed something that is great, you could publish it yourself. Like, that was impossible when I was a kid,
Oh, that's
right?
so cool.
Now, some of the pioneers in the space sort of did that with the shareware models, basically would give it away to people and then say, hey, if you like it,
Yeah.
give us some money for it. And they managed to like create this sort of internet before the internet, but it was all done with like snail mail stuff. So
Interesting.
it'd be really hard to do that growing up. But now there's all kinds of different stores. And there's all kinds of platforms, whether it's a board game that you're making or a tabletop RPG or
Even.
a very rich or first person shooter, third person shooter, whatever. In Unreal, those tools are accessible and you can publish to Steam, right? I mean,
Yeah.
anyone can do it. Anyone can publish to Google Play. Apple is a little more challenging,
Yeah.
but anyone really can do it. You just have to pay $100 or whatever they're charging these days
Yeah.
to become an Apple developer. And then you can publish stuff to their store and it has to go through review or whatever. But yeah, that was impossible in the past. Even what I am, I'm still an independent Nintendo developer. Now, I haven't published anything with Nintendo.
Yeah.
And just not too long after I became an independent Nintendo developer, I started working on Super Nintendo World.
That's so cool.
So it kind of derailed my development with this game I was going to try to bring to Nintendo platforms. And I'm at a point right now where I'd love to do it, but it's just money I don't have. I'd have to get them to give me dev kits. I don't really like the Wii, to be honest.
Yeah.
Uh,
Don't tell
I
that.
was excited. I was excited to make a 3DS game, but
That
that's
is
not
cool.
that's not possible anymore. They don't publish for it. Yeah. So, but anyone almost can become an independent Nintendo developer these days. You just have to kind of apply to it, and they have sort of a generous program to help you. And that was impossible. I approached Nintendo when I was younger to try to get games onto their platforms or to try to get their technology because I was just such a loyal fan and what really wanted to be part of Nintendo. And the answer was always absolutely not. There's no way.
Yeah.
You don't work here. You'll never see what we're making. They're very, very secretive. I mean, even when I was working with Nintendo at Universal, they're extremely secretive about Nintendo stuff with Universal and wouldn't reveal product launch windows or anything to us,
Oh,
which
interesting.
might have been really helpful in some ways. But, that's just the level of secrecy that they have. But that changed, I don't know how many years ago it was now, 7 years ago, something like that. They started the indie program. And just so you, as an independent developer, you can get on Nintendo platforms. You don't have to be a big studio anymore.
Interesting. Well, Stephen, that will wind us down. Thank you so much for joining us. It's so cool to peel back the onion on how like video games are created and like how you can get into it. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to find me on the internet and follow up.
Perfect. And everyone, those links will be down below and definitely do. Thank you so much for joining us.